The Army was interested in my work because my work is focused on the idea that the purpose of human intelligence is to make plans. The Army was like, look, Professor Fletcher, everybody thinks you're nuts, but your criticism of the existing way of thought really fits with our own. And so we'd like to test your alternative, because you haven't just criticized the existing way, you've proposed an alternative, and you think that it's possible to train up these other parts of the human brain. We see that you don't have a lot of research on that mostly this is theoretical. The equivalent of a theoretical physicist, essentially, who's never been allowed to build his own rocket ship because you've never been given the budget. What if we gave you the budget?
Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Weeks. Welcome to the Bounce Podcast. I think as AI, artificial intelligence, becomes more and more a part of our daily lives, we're going to be asking the bigger questions like, what is the true nature of human intelligence? And for me, that contrast between the systems we're building and the deeply biological, emotional, and intuitive intelligence we already carry is becoming really fascinating. And that's in part what this episode explores. My guest is Angus Fletcher. Angus is professor at Ohio State's Project Narrative. His research has been called life-changing by Brene Brown and others. He has been endorsed by neuroscientists, psychologists, and doctors such as Martin Seligman, Antonio Damasio, and it's been supported by institutions like the National Science Foundation. And in 2023, he was awarded the Commendation Medal by the U.S. Army for his groundbreaking research with the U.S. Army Special Forces. His most recent book is the national bestseller, Primal Intelligence, and it is the touchstone of this episode. Angus has a very unusual career arc that you'll hear about, from building mutant neurons in a lab to studying Shakespeare at Yale and Stanford to being recruited by the U.S. Army Special Ops Command to train their elite teams. Angus argues that things like imagination, common sense, intuition, they're trainable, even though they're hardwired survival tools that computers can't replicate, at least not yet. And he says they're exactly what we need in today's very uncertain world. So we dig into all of that, and he does some comparison between biological and computational intelligence, how the Army tested his theories under life pressure, why they worked. And then we get into emotions. I kind of park there with him for a while, and why they're not necessarily just wild forces to be suppressed. And in fact, we discuss fear and anger and how they are signals about plans rather than signals about the world. And then he offers some really great exercises from the special operators on how to turn anger on and off. We discuss emotions as signals to guide us instead of obstacles that sabotage us. He has a surprising take on gratitude, which I thought was very neat. And we discuss how to practice that. All of this feeds into resilience, thriving in uncertainty. Without further ado, here's Angus Fletcher. Thank you, Angus, for coming on. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much for taking the time.
I'm super excited to be here, Larry.
I'm super excited about your book and these concepts, and I have so many questions. The challenge, as you probably know, but certainly when I'm interviewing somebody or talking to him, is there's just so many potential limbs off the tree I could go down. I may jump around, so please bear with me, but there's so much in your book and the concepts that are so fascinating. It's like, oh shit, what do I focus on to get the meat out of here? Obviously, I push people to the book, but I'll do my best.
For most of my career, I've been treated as though I was something of a lunatic because my ideas are so different. And over the last couple of years, that's kind of turned around, largely because the U.S. Army and U.S. Army Special Operations has got behind me. And the book actually became an instant national bestseller, something to my surprise. So I think I'm sort of existing in this moment where I'm aware that my ideas are still very different. I'm aware that it's probably, a little bit awkward to figure out where to start talking about them, because it's not like I come off the tree of organizational psychology or something and I'm just, a little bit of a tweak here, a little bit of a tweak there. I mean, my theory of resilience is profoundly different from most people's theories of resilience. I go against a lot of the things that are taught nowadays because I come at things from a neuroscience perspective as opposed to a psychology perspective. And so really wherever you want to start is fine with me.
Let me start with your career, because it's always fascinating, the squiggly lines of a career and the twists and turns and how someone winds up somewhere. I know I started in a weird spot. Can't believe where I wound up. But I think you started in neuroscience. you switched to Shakespeare, or
Yeah,
how does I see how it fits story, narrative, humans, blah, 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 right? Fits. But was that on purpose?
No. My career is basically the result of chasing my curiosity and unanswered scientific questions. And I actually think about narrative very differently than most people, which we'll get into. I don't think of narrative as a tool for communicating. I think of it as a tool for thinking. And that's just one of many idiosyncrasies of my worldview. But basically, I did start in neuroscience, but I started out in a specific field of neuroscience. Neuroscience means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And in fact, neuroscience has often become conflated, I would say, with psychology. Anyone who studies the brain has often said that they study neuroscience. But I came up in neurophysiology, which and specifically at a lab at the University of Michigan Medical School. What we really did was we studied how individual neurons worked. And my job was essentially to go in and create mutant neurons and see how that changed their function. And so we were very interested on a very granular physical level of understanding how the smallest components of human intelligence operated. And so unlike, say, a psychologist who examines their own mind by sort of interrogating their own consciousness, by thinking about how maybe other people's minds worked, we started at it from a very hardware perspective. And that's also the way that I study things like AI. I don't study AI by using ChatGPT. I study AI by literally breaking down the components of a computer. And so my background is really in the physical mechanisms that drive intelligence. And while I was in the neurophysiology lab, one of the things that I came to believe was that the human brain just functioned very, very differently from computers. Computers, without going into onerous detail, computers require a lot of information to be smart. The more data you give a computer, the more likely it is to spit out the right answer to you. Whereas humans, the more information you give us, the more quickly we get overwhelmed. If I give you a whole spreadsheet full of stuff, you just glaze over. On the other hand, humans are very good at thinking in narrative. So if I tell you an interesting story, you can pay attention for hours. And what that is a reflection of is a deeper fact, which is that narratives are made up of actions. They're made up of events, which are actions. And the human brain evolved to think in action, not in numbers, not in data. What's an action? What's the value of action? Well, action is how life works. The purpose of your brain is essentially to innovate action, is to create new behaviors, is to allow you to do things that other people haven't done before. And what that allows you to do is escape predators, because if you can act in a way that no predator has seen before, you're going to be the gazelle that isn't eaten. But it also allows you to seize onto opportunities faster than other people. If you're an entrepreneur and you're able to act in a different way, if you're an inventor and you're able to manipulate technology in a different way, that's what allows you to create the future. And so the human brain thinks in action. Actions chain together are narratives. I realized that no one in neuroscience was really studying this. They were all studying computation and data processing and sort of how vision works, because, our visual cortex is essentially a computer. And so I said, I want to understand how narrative works in the brain, because I think that's the fundamental component of human intelligence. Let me go to an English department and study Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is obviously an expert in narrative. And that was a moment in my career when I realized, in fact, the literature departments, Shakespeare departments did not study narrative. And I sort of ended up spending the next 25 years almost on a kind of like wandering quest to figure out how narrative worked. Much of it was sort of bootstrapped.
So we're going to get into the concepts of primal intelligence, the title of your book. And I think it's very cool that the U.S. Army formally recognized the research you did. And I think you were awarded a medal was it 2023?
That's correct. Yeah, I was awarded the Commendation Medal for groundbreaking research.
How does this happen? Like, how did the Army find you? Yeah. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but it is surprising.
No, this is a great question. It's surprising.
Because we're talking to a degree of soft skills. And forgive me, I know it's more complex than that. So how did that relationship start? Yeah. And what convinced them that this wasn't just some new age theory or whatever, right? Or but a different way to cultivate intelligence.
Sorry. I'll tell you the story of the Army in a second, but I do want to just put a pin on something you said, which is that this contrast that people make between quantitative skills and soft skills, which I think is nuts. It also goes along with the qualitative distinction, which is nuts. Quantitative approaches to life, these mathematical approaches to life, they're a tool. And they're a useful and interesting tool, but they're a small fraction of intelligence. And for some reason, they've been allowed to perjure all these other methods of inquiry. The scientific method is itself not quantitative. The scientific method is rooted in imagination and experimental feedback and things like that. So I just want to put out there that I totally understand where you're coming from. And I just want to encourage members of the audience who have the same skepticism that I have towards the idea that somehow if something is not mathematical or logic, therefore it is mystical or mythical or soft, to say that you're in strong biological grounds. But
well, that's a great point. Should we, and that's a heuristic that's everywhere, especially corporate, right?
Yeah.
But is there another category we should add to hard, soft, or would you bucket it in hard, everything in hard or everything in soft?
Okay, let me give you a broader framework and then we can discuss the hard, soft thing. So essentially,
and by the way, this isn't important. I was just curious. Since
no, it is important. It is important because this totally shapes how we think about intelligence nowadays, and it leads to this hierarchy and the sense that certain people are smarter than others and therefore should be put in charge of decision making. And we have this bias now that people who understand numbers are smarter than people who deal in other methods, and therefore the people in numbers should be put in charge of decision making. And for lots of reasons, I think that's a mistake, and the Army, as we'll talk about, also thinks that's a mistake. But the way that we think about intelligence now, 99.9% of people basically think that intelligence falls into one of two categories. The first category is logic, or more specifically, computation, something that can be reduced to computational processes that can be run on a computer. We could talk about what those are, but those can include, quantum computing. Those can include neurosymbolic logic. Those can include generative AI. Those include interpretation, system 1, system 2, critical thinking, all that kind of stuff. That all goes in the computation bucket. What's the other bucket? It's magic. It's essentially some emergent quality that is often associated with, consciousness or something like that just happens to occur. There's something maybe spiritual, mythical about it. And this leads to a whole host of misconceptions. The first misconception is that somehow if computers achieve consciousness, we'll get AGI. Another mistake is that because this other bucket of intelligence is ineffable, that we can never really learn how it works, what its mechanics are. And because we can never learn what its mechanics are, we can never build it into schools. So we can never train up processes like imagination or intuition, because on some level, it's just magic. And this is as crazy a bifurcation as if you walked into an engineering class and they said to you, there's exactly two types of tools, the hammer and prayer. You either build everything with a hammer, and we've got all this kind of stuff on how hammers work, or you just kind of wish and hope that it happens. And of course, the reality we know about engineering is that there are multiple kinds of tools that are irreducible. So you can't reduce a hammer to a saw or a saw to a hammer. You can't reduce a camera to a toaster or a toaster to a combustion engine. These are different mechanical processes. And so computation is one mechanical process that drives intelligence, but it's probably 5% of intelligence. And the remaining 95%, or at least 90% of it, is other mechanical processes that have not been researched thoroughly. And probably only a tiny percentage of it, if at all, is just magic. And so we're missing out this huge area in the middle. And that area in the middle is not hard or soft. It's biological. So I would say the difference that we see in the workplace now is between logical intelligence and biological intelligence. And logical intelligence is anything that can run on a computer, and biological intelligence is anything that only humans can do and computers can't. And biological intelligence is more ancient than logical intelligence. It can do many, 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 many more things. And one of the most profound things it can do is operate with limited information. And that's what allows it to operate in volatile environments and uncertain environments where AI hardwires. So this is why, generally, when you look at the top of organizations, they're not run by numbers people. They're run by people who have strategic vision, high amounts of imagination, the ability to communicate with others. These kinds of skills, which cannot be run by computers, and which we now tend to treat as though they're magical, like some people just happen to have them. But as I talk about in the book, these are all things that can be trained up at scale. Students can get better at them. We can all get better at them. The problem is we're now living in a world where we're all taught logic all the time. Everything we do in school is logic. And so we've made our own intelligence brittle, and we're depleting our natural capacity to be leaders.
Yeah, this is great. But and by the way, I want to get into computer thinking and AI further down the conversation list, because that's incredibly fascinating. But sorry, my Alexa AI is talking to me. Can you hear that?
I can, but I think this is absolutely perfect, because this
What's
is
funny,
the problem
exactly
with AI, right? Yeah.
So I've named Alexa computer to mimic Star Trek. So anytime I say computer, it responds and talks to me. So anyway, oh my gosh, now it's calling me captain. This is hilarious. This is the first time this has happened.
But by the way, this is what I do. I break AI. I mean, this is why I was brought in to work with the U.S. military to answer your earlier question.
All my
Yeah,
systems
yeah,
are going off like,
yeah. Human
so
intelligence against the machine.
yeah, because you do make the point, and I want to get into this, that people over rely on logic. I'm simplifying, and thinking like a computer can actually weaken them in a sense. It can make them anxious, rigid, or dependent on authority. So I want to get into that because part of me thinks, and this is not, again, not important, but this is the challenge of this kind of conversation, because I think even emotions and imagination, some of the things you bucket into primal intelligence, have some form of logic in them, right? In other words, if I get attacked by a saber-toothed tiger back in the day, my emotions are going to be predictive in nature from that point on when I hear something similar to rustling in the bushes. So there's some logic built into it, right? In other words, if then, if this, then that. But
no, I mean, that's a common misunderstanding of how logic operates. We can talk about that, but if then statements are not causal statements, they're correlational statements. Those kinds of processes that you're talking about in a state of nature are actually narrative processes in which you're basically predicting a sequence of events are going to occur based on some departure from your environmental norms. That's not actually logic. To be clear, logic could not be hardwired into computers if it was not rigorously formalized. And one of the main problems I think people have when they interact with computers is they understand how their own brains work, and then they map a lot of those processes onto computers. It's like when people name their cars and they give their car a name, just like you named Alexa, and now you're having interaction with it. What you're actually having there is you're taking your own brain processes, you're committing what we call the pathetic fallacy, which is you map human intelligence onto your pet, for example. You think your pet is smarter than it is, right?
So anthropomorphizing
things,
yeah.
Exactly, right. Yeah. And so just to be clear, when I talk about logic, I'm not talking about things that make sense to a person, because things that make sense to a person make sense for lots of reasons that are a lot of times independent of logic, because as we've talked about, logic is a big data system, and logic can really only operate if you'd seen thousands of saber-toothed tigers and been able to develop inductive generalizations off them, which you'd then been able to use to drive deduction, another forms of thought. Logic is and or not operations. They're defined by Aristotle. You can read about them in Bertrand Russell. You can read about them in any kind of analytic logic textbook. They're hardwired into computers as NAND NOR gates, or typically just either NAND or NOR gates. And for people who are interested, you can read about the history of this stuff through Claude Shannon and Alan Turing and whatnot. But it's a very specific, simple, elegant process, which is why it's allowed to scale. Which is why it's able to scale. But that same simplicity is also why it can only handle a very narrow range of problems. Whereas with humans, we have something called practical reason, which is, philosophers will call practical reason. And a lot of stuff that we colloquially call logic is just practical reason. And practical reason, as I talk about in the book, is driven by these narrative processes. And the reason that's important is because they're non-computational. The more time you spend with computers, the worse you get at these narrative processes. And the classic example is common sense. Common sense, everybody kind of knows what common sense is, right? We also know that computers don't have it at all. A computer can have huge amounts of information and do something that's just obviously totally ridiculous. And we also know that common sense is declining in young people because they're spending so much time in schools that run standardized tests, quantitative methods, all these things that are basically computational logic. And so common sense is a classic example of something that people would say is logical, but is in fact not logical. You can't get by any known set of derivations from and or not to common sense. People have tried for a long time, and there's lots of spurious attempts, like the idea, like abduction, for example, which is a sort of famous, brilliant, but undefined process. So just to be clear, logic in colloquial language means something totally different in computer science. And a lot of the things that ordinary people think of as logical are actually primal intelligence or narrative processes, like I talk about in the book, that are impossible, and I think will always be impossible for computers.
Is it then your thesis that primal intelligence that you talk about in the book, these concepts, are hardwired in us and inherited and embodied, but is that the case?
Well, they're a result of the structure of the neuron. So I don't want to get too technical because I don't know how much your audience cares about this kind of stuff, but the brain is a mixed electronic, non-electronic architecture, which means it can do things that purely electronic systems like computers can't do. And the simplest example of this is the synapse. So the synapse is the connection between two neurons. And in the mid-20th century, a lot of scientists thought that the synapse was electrical, but it turns out it's not. It's mechanical, it's physical. And the reason that matters is that synapses can connect in ways that don't obey the laws of electronic design. So your brain can wire itself in ways that if you tried to put that into a computer would cause it to short circuit is the simple of that. It also means the human brain is able to improvise things in ways that a computer can't. A computer's software can rearrange itself, but its hardware can't because the electronics would melt, right? If you had like a computer that was constantly improvising its own electronic architecture, it would short out very rapidly. Your brain is able to improvise its own essentially hardware, its own kind of neural connections. And so without getting into gross detail, what I would basically say is that the neuron is far more complicated than a transistor and is able to do far more mechanical functions. And you should think of it more as a Swiss Army knife. And you should say to yourself, what can I do with a Swiss Army knife that I can't do with a calculator? And the answer is almost everything, right? Almost everything. And that's what your brain is. Your brain is a Swiss Army knife and a computer is a calculator. And increasingly, we're trying to use calculators to solve real world problems. And when that's not happening, we're then trying to make the real world obey the laws of math by rigging economies and engaging in other kinds of chicanery. And the result is, or by making school systems that essentially treat kids as though they're algorithms. And the result is that we're actually making ourselves dumber and more fragile. And so the main point I just want to get across is that the neuron is much more mechanically sophisticated and complicated than a transistor, which means that your brain has the capacity to be smart in ways that no AI ever will.
By the way, I'm not discounting magic. The older I get, the more I become more open to magic. And when I say that, I mean the mystery of things I can't explain.
100%. 100%.
Consciousness being one. I had
100%. Yeah, I agree.
I had Philip Goff on, that's physicist, and it was it was profound and mysterious to say the least. Panpsychism, and we had this whole conversation about what consciousness, how he sees consciousness, and the difference between humans and machines and AI, and what's needed for that to emerge, the biological substrate that we have that machines will never have, can't have. At least that's his theory. But anyway, with that said, let me just jump into, and I'm going to kind of simplify it, but you're bucketing. So in the primal intelligence bucket, you have intuition, imagination, emotion, and common sense, I think. Is that right? Did I get that?
That's correct. Yeah, that's
okay.
Correct. Yeah.
So why would the Army be interested in that? And how did that happen?
How did that happen? So basically, just fast track through my career. I was at Yale studying Shakespeare. That's where I went to study narratives. I realized that there wasn't a lot of actual narrative theory going on there, but I then got my first position at Stanford, where I was able to connect with places like Pixar, who were actually places that were making narratives. I then went down to LA, was a professor at the University of Southern California, where I worked a lot in Hollywood. And then I eventually got recruited to join Ohio State's Project Narrative, which is the world's leading academic institute for story. And so my whole career, I've basically been a neuroscientist who's been trying to understand narrative by working both within the academy, but also outside the academy with practitioners of narrative, whether those practitioners are theater people or film directors or what have you. But because I'm a neuroscientist inside an English department, which is a little bit of an anomaly to start with, English departments do have some scientists. We have linguists and folklorists and people like that. But I, to my knowledge, I'm the only neuroscientist who exists in an English department. Because I'm a neuroscientist in the English department, people for a long time have just thought that I was really kind of nuts. And the wonderful thing about English departments is they embrace lunacy to a certain extent. I mean, if you meet someone on any college campus who's totally bonkers, you can be almost certain that they've come out of the English department. And that means that English departments encourage, I think, a lot of really groundbreaking stuff, but they also encourage a lot of stuff that makes people uncomfortable and people think is weird, and I was definitely one of those folks. And so for a long time, people were like, oh, Angus, when I talk to him, he seems really sensible, but everything he says just disagrees with everything I've read in every single book. So he must be nuts, And then, to your point, 4.5 years ago, I get a knock on my door from the U.S. Army. And initially, I was not aware that it was U.S. Army Special Operations. I just thought it was the U.S. Army. I was, like many college faculty, when I discovered the U.S. Army, was reading my research and nervous and perturbed. I'm actually an immigrant. I'm a naturalized citizen. So actually, my first response when I heard the Army was investigating me was a little bit of terror. Like I thought, oh my goodness, I might be getting into trouble. I might be getting thrown out of the country. That wasn't the case. What the Army told me was that they had been studying my research. And the reason they've been studying my research is because, they did think it was very weird, but they had this. So first of all, without giving away any secrets, I don't have a security clearance with the U.S. Army. So I've seen a lot of things that technically I guess I could reveal, but I have a sort of a friendship pact, I say, with the U.S. Army. So sometimes your friends tell you things in confidence and you don't share them. So,
or you'd have to kill me.
I mean, believe me, I'm the last person who could kill you. Actually, I don't have any. Even though I work with operators, I'm not myself a lethal force. But the U.S. Army, and you can check this stuff online. The U.S. Army has a couple teams that are part of what's called Special Operations Command. And in particular, Joint Special Operations Command, it has two classified units that work in Joint Special Operations Command. One of them is quite famous. It's a direct action unit, and the other one is not famous. You can find it on open source sites, but what it does largely remains a mystery. And the reason for that is it has, I would say, almost like a James Bond element to it. It consists of a lot of individual operators whose job is basically to see the future and to anticipate problems that haven't happened yet, but might happen in the next 5, 10, even 100 years, and go around and try and find answers to those problems. And I was, of course, totally fascinated to discover the U.S. Army has this, but it makes sense. The Army is always trying to think a few steps ahead is essentially what's going on there. They're sort of trying to anticipate the future. And
this is not the extrasensory perception division.
No, okay. There's no, I mean,
I'm just playing. Yeah.
One of the things I joke about in
the men who stared at goats. Yeah.
Men who stare at goats. Yeah. One of the things I joke about in the book is that the Army does often investigate those kinds of things because it's kind of its job, right? Is to go around and kind of test this stuff. But anyway, I was put on this list. And the reason I was put on this list is because they had identified me as someone who had a very large number of high quality publications, which were defined as, publications in very sort of significant journals. I'd published in a lot of different kinds of journals, yet had a very low citation count, which is to say that I was getting cited at a very low rate by other scholars. And the Army had determined that this was indicative of this was a sign of a potential innovative way of thinking. Because if you're able to get these ideas out there, but no one really knows how to cite them, so scholars recognize that they're valuable, but scholars can't really engage with them, it might be the sign of a paradigm shift. That was what I was told by the Army. And so
interesting.
So I got on this list of scholars. I don't know how many scholars are on that list or what, or where the list is. I just know that I got on the list. And then eventually, I got promoted off that list onto a shorter list, which was people that the Army wanted to contact. And the reason I got promoted onto that shorter list is because once the Army started reading my work, they realized that everything I was saying in my papers was predicting things that was going on in their organization at that time. And in particular, what I was predicting was that the more you trained people in rational decision-making and all the other kinds, kind of Daniel Kahneman stuff, pattern matching, all these computational approaches to thinking, or ideation, design thinking, these are all kind of part of the same sort of computational approach to intelligence. The more you trained people in these methods, the less effective they got in novel environments. And the reason they got less effective is because they were less capable of making new and effective plans. So to your point about why the Army was interested in my work, the Army was interested in my work because my work is focused on the idea that the purpose of human intelligence is to make plans. Why? Because another name for a plan is a plot. Another name for a plot is a story. So I think that narrative and story evolved in the human brain as a way of us imagining stories of the future, which is to say plans. And then we make those plans come true by figuring out all the steps we need to take, just like a screenwriter figures out all the steps they need to take in a plot to make the ending come true. We figure out all those individual steps as these narrative sequences of events. And so the Army was like, look, Professor Fletcher, everybody thinks you're nuts, but your criticism of the existing way of thought really fits with our own. And so we'd like to test your alternative because you haven't just criticized the existing way, you've proposed an alternative and you think that it's possible to train up these other parts of the human brain. And we see that you don't have a lot of research on that mostly this is theoretical, that you're the equivalent of a theoretical physicist, essentially, who's never been allowed to build his own rocket ship because you've never been given the budget. What if we gave you the budget? What if we brought you in and allowed you to test your theories on our most elite units and we could see whether your theories made them better at making plans in chaos, or as the Army refers to it, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. So the Army basically said, we'll give you some time to test your theories. And what ended up happening is that the theories worked. The training worked. It made the operators more effective. And then the Army started testing these theories in other units, including conventional Army, and they continued to work. And then we took them out of the conventional Army and put them into elementary schools and high schools. And now we're starting to put them into colleges. And we started to see that they continued to work. And so circling back to the beginning of your question, just for simplicity's sake, I break planning down into kind of 4 simple processes. And these processes, I just want to emphasize, are heuristic. I don't want to imply that somehow these exist in separate quadrants of the human brain, but they're a helpful way for people to do the training. And so the first process is intuition. Intuition is your ability to spot opportunities. Opportunities are exceptions to the known laws of your environment. And so what those exceptions are telling you is that more can happen in this environment than has happened in the past. So they're the leading edge of the future. If you can seize on those exceptions, you can leverage on them to innovate. Or alternatively, those exceptions might be emergent threats or challenges that you've got to figure out how to contend with. So the first thing that we trained up with the military was intuition, so they could spot opportunities and threats faster. The second thing, imagination. What that does is that's your brain's ability to make plans, to take an individual exception and translate that into a novel sequence of actions. So we then, once you can spot exceptions, you can say, okay, well, here's how I would grab that exception and turn it into a new technology or a new business or a new form of art or something like that. So now you've got intuition and imagination going, and so you're making all of these plans. But then the question is, which plans should I use? One of the things we know about highly imaginative or highly creative people is they often get overwhelmed by the number of plans that they have in their heads. And a lot of times they are not that successful in their life, even though they have all these plans. Why is that? The next power is common sense. Common sense is your ability to pick the right plan for the moment. What plan matches the moment you're in? And the simple way to think about common sense is the newer your environment is, the newer that your plan has to be. So if you're in an environment where just a little bit has changed, you should go with a pretty conservative plan. If you're in a highly volatile environment, you need to go with something dramatically new. And so that process, common sense, which again, we trained up with the Army, helps you decide which of those plans you've imagined is the right one for your situation. And then the final power, which is emotion, helps you determine which plans are right for you personally. Because, one of the things is you can come up with lots of plans that can be effective, but they just don't fit with who you feel that you are. And as individuals, we have a strong sense of our own personal narratives, what our own story is. And emotion is what helps you navigate between your own personal story and the plans that you launch in the world so that you don't get lost in a success that is really meant for somebody else. So those are the 4 primal powers that I talk about in the book. And then, of course, I also talk about how they originated in the brain and how you train them. But that's the kind of core of the training.
So is it okay, because I'm going to push people to the book. By the way, I loved it. But it surprised me, and I thought it was one thing, the book, the content of the book, but it was not what I thought. Obviously, I brought a lot of my own ideas when I saw the word primal intelligence and then intuition. You know what I mean? You have a bunch of ideas about these things. One of the things that I took away that is helpful to me and is becoming more and more helpful is it okay, Angus, because we can't give a thorough representation totally, I guess we could, but it would take all day about the book. But is it okay if I'm going to pull out some of these parts of the primal intelligence and focus on them? Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah, 100%. So, first of all, I would be happy if nobody ever bought the book and just took this podcast and used it, because I'm not here to sell books. So don't worry about giving.
No.
I'd like the knowledge to be released into the universe, however it gets released.
So let's give somebody a taste of it. And obviously, I'm going to regurgitate my interpretation of various things. But again, I had my own thoughts, like primal intelligence. My first thought was intuition. This is all about intuition. The whole thing I thought was going to be intuition. In fact, even as I was reading, I'm like, this is going to be about, but it's not. I mean, that's a part. And then I was surprised to see imagination in there, but then I certainly understood how that's used, and that was pretty cool. When it comes to emotion, this is what I came away with, and then I have so many questions around it, is that there's a bias that I have because of emotional overreactions to things, that, emotions are some wild animals to be tamed and to be clamped down and to be put in a therapy chair and talked through, right? Which is in some cases true. By the way, I had Lisa Fieldman Barrett on. I don't know if you've studied much of her research on how emotions are made. And she talks about the predictive nature of feelings and then how we layer our emotional concepts on top of that. So I'm reading about emotions in your book, and I'm like, oh, so this is what I got out of it, because I do know emotions can get in the way. And personally, I don't want to make a big decision when I'm at emotional level 10. I'm just not thinking straight, right? And sometimes I don't even know what's going on, but I'm flashing red, and I'm like, so I thought of a dashboard, and I thought that you are creating some kind of dashboard like I have in my car. So when the red light goes off, that's not good, but I need to look at the light and say, what is it? And then I need to investigate and go, oh, it's the tires are low, or I'm running low on oil. So he's nodding his head. So I'm on to something here. Okay. So I was like, oh, he has created this framework where I can place my emotions. And then when emotion is triggered, I could see it as a flashing light on my dash to investigate, right? And to not run from, but go, okay, what's it trying to tell me? Okay. And because I kind of already been going down this path in my personal life where I have a little technique where if I feel something negative, Angus, I will tune into my body and go, where am I feeling it? And I'll just say, what has happened? I'm feeling something, right? And then I'll investigate and go, is there any useful information in this feeling? Is it trying to tell me something? So if let's say I get some information like your taxes are due and you're late or something, okay? I'm making this up, but because I just finished my taxes. So I will then say, okay, that's useful information. My taxes are due. I'm late. I'm feeling a little anxiety. Is there anything I could do about it? So what do I do now? If there's nothing, I make a plan. I go, okay, when I get home, I'm going to do this. So now the light goes, oh, okay, you've checked into the light. Sometimes, Angus, I'll do this. Tell me what you think. I'll act like it's a telephone and I'll say, hello, I'm picking up the phone. What are you trying to tell me? Okay. I answered it. And just answering that phone the emotion tends to bend. So am I in the ballpark of what you're codifying?
So yes. And to be clear, I have to give full credit for all this work to U.S. Army Special Operations because I was not interested in emotion before I started working with them. And then we had a series of breakthroughs based on kind of working with operators. And to your point,
it's great. You have this, it's a very useful when these like anger, depression, whatever, grief, whenever they flash, you are investigating as this is useful information. This may be useful information.
It is.
Let's find out.
Useful. It's always useful. So emotions are the smartest thing in your brain. Emotions are the smartest thing in your brain. They're the most ancient form of intelligence in your brain, and they remain the most powerful forms of intelligence in your brain. And this is not a mistake. We're taught in the modern world that this is a mistake. You know, this idea goes back to people like Plato and whatnot. And, you know, you got to dissociate from your emotions. You got to control your emotions.
But can we hold two seemingly opposing ideas here where over emotional and you need to calm down before you do something? And
no. So let me explain to you. Let me explain to you. It all comes down to a simple misunderstanding. We think and are taught that emotions tell us about the world. They tell us nothing about the world. And that's why you don't want to use your emotions to make decisions about what to invest in or whatever, right? Emotions did not evolve in the brain to tell you about the world. They evolved to tell you what's going on inside your own brain. And they are 100% accurate about that. And so
about what's going on in your own brain,
your own brain. Yeah. And so the problem is that, you know, the classical kind of rational choice thing will be, oh, you know, you're angry now. Don't make a decision about your relationship when you're angry, you know, or don't make a decision about what to invest in when you feel euphoria or something like this, you know, because, you know, emotions are bad. Emotions never evolved to tell you what to do in terms of making choices about the outside world because they're not. How could your emotions possibly know anything about the outside world? This is this sort of weird psychic theory of intelligence that somehow intelligence can somehow understand and perceive things beyond itself. Emotions obviously evolved to understand your own brain. To your point, they're a signal system. They're a dashboard that is telling you what's going on inside your own brain. And they are 100% accurate about what's going on inside your own brain. They never get it wrong. And so when, for example, you get angry, you can probably guess what that's telling you, right? But when you get angry, what that's telling you is you're experiencing a threat response and you think that I have to respond aggressively to get out of the situation. That's what anger is telling you, that I've entered a threat response and I need to act aggressively to get out of the situation. And what that in turn is telling you is to say to yourself, am I actually in that kind of a situation or is there an alternative? Fear. What is fear telling you? Fear is telling you that you have no plan. The moment you start to get scared, that's saying, I don't have a plan. My brain doesn't have a plan that it trusts. And what follows from that is you have to say to yourself, okay, if I don't have a plan that I trust, I'm now becoming susceptible to other people. I'm losing my autonomy over my own life. I'm more likely to seek out the counsel of someone, a therapist, whomever, to tell me what to think or what to do. Do I want to do that? Or do I want to look inside my own life and start to figure it out for myself? Grief, shame, anger, we could go through all of these and kind of talk about them. But the core insight is that, as we know from watching a movie or reading a book, emotion and narrative are connected. That's why when you watch a story, it stimulates your emotions. And this has led us to think that the purpose of stories is to stimulate emotions in others. This is something that philosophers have said for a while. No. In fact, the purpose of emotions is to monitor your own life narrative. It's to tell you what's going on in terms of your own life story. So when you feel things like grief and shame, that's telling you that your behaviors are departing from your own life story. When you feel something like anger or fear, it's telling you that your life story, your life future is narrowing, is getting tighter. You have less room to maneuver. So as I talk about at great length in the book, the more you understand what your emotions are telling you, the more rapidly you can respond in terms of shifting your own life story to adapt to the situation that you're in. And you will then find that those emotions resolve.
Let's dig into, it could be anger or fear. I think you're talking about, because the emotions may not be telling you the truth. Again, to your point, it may not be telling you what's real on the outside in the world. It's telling you what's going on internally. So, cross T's there.
Because I'll walk you through it.
Let's say I'm angry because I've misinterpreted something a friend said, whatever, but I'm feeling the anger. Or you pick your own case study here, or
Sure.
All
right, let me start from the beginning. Anger and fear are the two faces of your fight or flight response. Fight is anger, flight is fear. So anger and fear are the twin faces of a threat response. Your brain is feeling under threat. So the first thing to know is that the moment you feel anger or fear, you're feeling threatened. What's the next thing to know? Your brain, when it feels threatened, wants to act. Your brain has a bias towards action. It believes that the only way that it learns, it grows, and also the only way that it can succeed and escape danger is by acting. And so the moment that your brain starts to feel under threat, it starts to feel a very strong desire to act. This is why it's impossible to relax if you feel under threat, right? Because your brain wants to act. It wants to fix the situation. So the basis of an action is a plan. So the moment you have a threat response, your brain wants a plan. That's always what it's looking for. So now that we understand that when you feel a threat response, your brain wants a plan. And again, this all comes from working with Army Special Operators because, of course, this is what you do when you're in a combat situation is you're constantly encountering threats and you're constantly making plans to respond to them. So how is it that fear and anger are different? And why is it that those specific emotions are the ones that evolved in the human brain as the faces of our threat response? Well, so let's start with fear. What fear is telling you is that you have no plan. It's telling you that you have no plan. There's nothing that you can think of yourself to do that you have confidence in.
By the way, you had a great, I think some kind of the way you phrased it that, your future, you only have one branch or path. You've eliminated other paths or something like that.
You actually have no future.
Oh.
So anger is one line and fear is no line. You actually don't know what to do. You have nothing that you feel confident in. Because your brain has a bias to action, it needs a plan. So fear evolved to get a plan the simplest way by taking it from somebody else. And that's why fear makes you susceptible to other people. That's why, if you're an autocrat, you try and make everyone afraid because it makes them more susceptible to listening to what they're told to do. That's why we have herd behavior. People get scared and they all congregate together. Fear evolved in the brain as a way of enabling this bias to action by taking a plan from your environment. College kids, I work with college kids all the time. They experience very little fear when they're 18 and 19. And then all of a sudden, when they're about to graduate, they get very nervous. All of a sudden, they start turning to their parents for advice. They start turning to their teachers for advice, right? Because they want a plan from somebody else because they don't have confidence in their own ability to make a plan. And the reason this is absolutely critical is if you take a plan from somebody else, you lose your own life story. You lose your own life story. And so actually what I do when I work with college kids is I say, when you feel scared and you start to think, I should go talk to other people and get their advice. No, do not do that. Instead, start to look back over your own life story and start to identify moments where you are proud of yourself for successes that you've had and start to study those moments and imagine what that person would do now in your current situation. So go back to your own life narrative and figure out how to extend it organically rather than trying to put somebody else's life onto your own, because what will end up happening is you'll have a kind of a short-term fix that'll get you going, but over time your life story will fragment because it'll be a bunch of Frankenstein plans that have been taken from other people. And this is why so many people in our society today are lost. They're confused, because they've taken all these different plans from their environment, from the internet, from self-help books, from inspirational movies, and they've essentially just fractured their own life story through a series of these panic responses and then reaching externally for help. So that is fear. What anger is telling you is that you've got only one plan. You've only got one plan. Anger is a way of saying you've got one plan. Well, why does your brain get angry if you only have one plan? Why would that be the evolved mechanism? And the answer is that plans are more likely to work when you act assertively on them. This is why you've probably noticed this in your own life, that people who are assertive tend to be more successful, at least in the short term, than people that are tentative. Your brain has learned this. And so it thinks, if I've only got one plan, I've got to get very, very aggressive because this is my only chance to get out of here. And you see this all the time with soldiers on the battlefield. If they get locked in on something, they go hard for it. Now, even though it's smart to act assertively on your plans, if you act angrily or aggressively when you only have one plan, what's the problem? The problem is if that plan doesn't work. Because then what happens is you tried to use your plan, you got angry, you got aggressive, and that plan broke. Now you've got no plan. And so now you're scared and you're retreating and looking to somebody else for help. Also, you've probably aggravated everyone else around you, right? By getting aggressive and hostile, So really, in the same way that fear is a signal to look back into your own life story and figure out who you are and what your first step forward is as yourself without taking advice from other people, anger is an indication to you, whoa, you're getting yourself into a situation where you only see one path ahead. Slow down, find other paths. Look around your environment. In the case of a conversation with a friend, right? If you're getting angry at a friend, most answers in human relationships are just figuring out a different way to communicate with the person. Saying, you know what, I didn't explain myself properly, or I'm not listening. And then once you start to get into that, you realize your anger will go away. You'll have other plans for dealing with the situation.
Right. That's multiple plans. Yeah. So in both cases, there needs to be a plan. One is there is no plan, the fear, right. Create a plan. The other is you've narrowed down to, you just have one plan. It's being thwarted.
Yep.
Your anger.
You're angry.
Have other plans. So that's very helpful. It also amplifies some of the guy who lost the emotional aspect of his brain, the brain injury. Am I getting that right?
Are you talking about Phineas Gage, who lost part of his...
Phineas Gage, I'm sorry. And he couldn't make a decision because he lost... Yes.
One of the things we know about the human brain, which is totally fascinating, is that if you think you should do something, you very rarely do it. But if you feel you should do something, you almost always do. And what that's telling you is that emotion is a big driver of behavior. It's driving your behaviors. And it's telling you that that's kind of your fallback mechanism to keep you out of trouble. And so even though people today are very suspicious of emotions, that's largely because they don't understand them. And so people spend most of their time dissociating or repressing their emotions. And then when they get into relationships, they're not able to communicate or explain or introspect on why they're having these emotions. And so these emotions basically break containment and explode and cause all this kind of interpersonal strife. Whereas if we started teaching children at a young age, it's totally normal and fine to be angry. It's totally normal to be angry. But what that's telling you is that there's only your brain only thinks there's one way of dealing with this situation. Do you really think that there's only one way of dealing with this situation? When we do this exercise with 8-year-olds, they very quickly say, no, there's another way of dealing with the situation. Okay, well, what is that? Well, I could do this or I could do that. And say, okay, do you feel angry anymore? No, I don't feel angry anymore. And so by helping kids actually understand what their emotions are, you then make them more able to have relationships, friend relationships, romantic relationships, where anger and other feelings come up. Because the moment those feelings come up, you understand what your brain is telling you about yourself, not about the other person. So that instead of taking anger as a sign that the other person has wronged me and the other person is bad and I've got to attack them, you instead say, oh, anger is a sign that I'm not thinking imaginatively enough about how to communicate with this person. Anger is a sign that I myself am failing to come up with a wide enough variety of plans for dealing with this complex situation, which is this other person who's different from me. And so once you start to understand that emotion is that emotion is 100% reliable about telling you what's going on in your own brain, and get out of the fallacy that emotion has anything to tell you whatsoever about what's going on in other people's heads or in the world at large, it becomes the most useful part of your intelligence.
So help us make use of emotions in this way, because I think this is where I may struggle and others may too. I may be proxy. Depending on the emotion, let's say anger or fear, and let's say, if I quantify it, level 10, it just really flooded with, I'm emotionally flooded to a degree. It's so embodied that I feel possessed almost. It's hard to move physically, much less think through what's going on. Does that make sense? So
yeah,
I certainly understand. Here's a signal. Let me investigate to see, do I have a plan? What do I think is going on here? But in between the feeling and that thinking through could be problematic. Is there any
yeah.
tips? Is there any tips to cross that bridge?
So let me explain to you why this
outside
came up,
outside of me token or something. Yeah.
So I started to work in these operator communities, with special operators that have divorce rates of something like 90%. And the reason they have these divorce rates, one of the reasons anyway, is that the operators blow up in their relationships and then become incredibly verbally and sometimes physically destructive towards their partners. And they're bringing all this anger into the domestic space with them. Why? Because they don't know how to interact with their spouse. They can't make a plan, essentially, for how to respond when something happens outside of this environment, outside of their sort of known environment, which is war. And so what I did with these operators is, first of all, I sat down with them. I was like, do you guys get angry in battle? They're like, no, not usually. Sometimes, if something goes really out of control, but for the most part, no. And I'm like, well, you're dealing with a far greater threat in combat than you are with your wife, right? Your wife's not about to actually kill you. So what's going on here? And it's like, well, because I'm able to make a plan much more rapidly for dealing with these situations. I say, okay, so let's start actually talking through, when your wife isn't in the room, how to make some plans. What's an example of a kind of problem that you have with your wife, right? And we start applying processes like intuition and imagination to making these plans ahead of time. And what that's telling your brain is that I can make a plan. So when my wife triggers me, right, through no fault of her own, but really a fault of my own, my inability to make a plan, I remember, you know what? When I was working with Angus, I was able to use my imagination to make a plan. So let me go back to that now. So the first thing that we do is we actually work with them on making those plans ahead of time so they develop their confidence in the moment to do it. And the more confident your brain is in the ability to make these plans, the less likely it is to go to level 10 anger. It'll go to level 8 anger, then it'll remember that it has that ability, then it'll go down to 6, 4, 2. You see what I'm saying? So that's
yeah. It's before
you've got to practice, right? Another thing to do is to sit down and actively remember times when you got angry, but then were able to get out of anger by making a second plan. And if you prime that memory in your brain of that time when you actually used this method, and then that's the first thing you recall when you get angry, your brain will immediately say, I can do it again. I can do it again. I can do it again. So priming that memory of a time when you responded to a situation where you felt under threat and you were getting angry by making a new plan. Everybody has that in their life. Everybody has had a moment where they're like, oh my goodness, I've got to get to this place on time. And now all of a sudden my car's not working and this guy's cut me off and And all of a sudden, you know what? I'm just going to just do I'm going to get there this other way, or I'm going to make a call and tell him I'm going to be 5 minutes late, or you know what I mean? Or right? Mm-hmm. And you remember that and you're like, if I could deal with that in that situation, I can deal with it in this situation. So reminding yourself of past situations. The final thing, and this is only for pros, I do this a lot with operators. I don't want to encourage people to do this at home if it makes them feel uncomfortable, but we work a lot with operators on turning anger on. We actually say anger, right, the way that you're dealing with it now is like some weapon that you're carrying around that you don't know how to use, because all of a sudden it's just going to suddenly go off, right? You're carrying around a weapon that is suddenly going to discharge because you have no idea, not just how to disarm it, but how to arm it, right? So we're going to understand the full mechanism of this by learning how to turn it on. And by learning how to turn it on, we're going to learn how to turn it off. And so we walk through this whole process. And again, this is about becoming comfortable with your emotions. Instead of being afraid of them and feeling, oh, I got to shut them down. It's like, no, let me understand them from the inside out. And the way we typically trigger anger in operators is we say to them, think about someone you love very much. Now imagine a threat to them. Imagine that threat getting closer, right? Do you feel yourself getting angry and what you want to do to that person, right? Okay, now imagine plans for dealing with that threat. Imagine multiple plans. Do you see how you're shifting out of anger and into positive action? So what we're doing in that situation is we're actually turning on anger and then turning it off. And once you learn how to turn on anger and turn it off, you're never going to get to level 10. Because anger is now inside your control. It's not something that is coming from the kind of the subterranean regions of your brain. It's something that's coming much more from the conscious forefront of your intelligence. So those are the kinds of things that we do with people. And we find even in operators who, believe me, have incandescent levels of rage. We find with operators that this works.
I come from a military family, so
Okay. Yes, you've probably seen what can happen. Yeah.
This is fascinating because I'm thinking multiple things. One is, it seems like the mechanism can also be giving the mind, the brain, something to do. Yes. When it's spinning on its. Much of my problem is rumination or playback, which is how I get worked up. There's that negative thought loop that happens because I don't have a plan, which means there's nothing else for my mind to move over to and say, okay, instead of doing this, I'm going to go over here and do that. It's kind of like meditation. Like if I'm really distracted in meditation, I normally do this kind of open awareness meditation, which is beautiful for me. But sometimes I'm so distracted or I've got a lot of going on in my head I'll do the TM kind of a focus word just to give my mind something. I'll just repeat a word, one, one, one. And my mind goes, oh, here's something over here. I'll do this.
Because what you're reminding your brain of is its self-efficacy. And that is what's eliminating the threat response, because the threat response is a feeling of powerlessness. And self-efficacy is a reminder of empowerment. I'll also say that,
So that's what the plan is doing. Is that?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. But even on a more fundamental level, of course, it's not just making your brain feel self-efficacy. It's actually giving your brain something to do. So, I mean,
that's what
overall,
I mean. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Another thing is the operators, most of them have tried meditation and mindfulness, and it has not worked for them. And so we give them another strategy. If mindfulness and meditation work, you should use them. I always say that to people. But if they don't work, we try other things. And so in the case of rumination, for example, we know that gratitude evolved in the human brain to interrupt rumination. And we also know that people misuse gratitude nowadays. People are grateful for good things. And so you're always being told, be grateful for all the good things in your life, yada, 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 right? That's what you're always told about. Take a moment and just cherish this moment. And that's a terribly ineffective use of gratitude.
Let me just say, gratitude is hard as hell. Yes. And I always wondered how best to do it. And the problem I've found for me is habituation. The things that are good in my life, you get used to them. So it's hard to.
That's right.
Ginny up.
Right. That's right.
Sorry, I interrupted.
That's not how gratitude is supposed to work. So you're trying to, the way that you're experiencing it.
Let's hear it. I'm waiting. That's
you're
great.
Supposed to be grateful for negative things.
Oh, now you lost me. Yeah. So you just.
Yeah, you're supposed to be grateful for negative things. Yeah, that's actually how, because by experiencing, so classically, like a simple example for this usually is people who exercise and starting to feel enthusiastic about the fact that your exercise is hard, that the work is hard. And if you start to look back in your own life, it's hard to have gratitude for negative things in your present, but it's usually fairly effective for most people to think back to challenging times in their past and see how they grew from them. And to say, you know what, I am grateful for that.
Right.
I am grateful for that. And then once you can start to be grateful for things in your very distant past, you can start to be grateful for things in your near past, and then you can start to be grateful for things in your present.
Am I grateful because I got through it? Help me out.
Grateful because you grew. So basically, there are two things that are most valuable in life from a biological perspective.
I have to be selective in the things that I'm grateful for. I grew. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be genuine. But so like there are two things that are valuable from a biological perspective in life, I think. Strength and wisdom. All strength comes from pain. All wisdom comes from suffering. And so anytime that you have strength or wisdom in your life, it traces back to something that was hard for you, that caused you discomfort, that you didn't like when it was happening. And so when you start to look back over your own life, and you have to start by doing this with your distant past first, because your immediate past, it's often too emotionally raw. But if you start looking back over your distant past, you start to think, you know what, I had that really bad time, but from that, I took this moment of wisdom, this insight that I was then able to pass on to other people or use in my own life, or I got stronger and more resilient in that moment. And I am grateful for that because that allowed me to handle this other hard thing. And when you start thinking about your distant past like that and have gratitude for those, you can then start thinking about your nearer past with gratitude, and you can start thinking about your present for gratitude. Because, when something bad happens to me in my day now, and again, this is something I learned from the operators, I'm like, you know what, this is awesome that something bad is happening now because I'm going to learn from it. I'm not going to die, right? I'm not dying right now. This is bad, but I'm not dying. I'm going to learn from it. And that wisdom and that strength is going to help me tomorrow. So you start to learn instant gratitude for hard things. And that is another way of very rapidly transitioning out of anger and fear.
That's a great tip. Is that in the book?
I don't remember if that's in the book or not. I think the thing about the book, to be totally honest, is it's a fraction of all the stuff that we did. And the reason it's a fraction of the stuff that we did is when I first gave the book to the publisher, they were like, this is too overwhelming. This is way too much stuff. Just try and simplify it so that someone can at least get their heads around it. So there's a lot of stuff that's not in there.
You said something great. You said all wisdom comes from suffering. What was the first part? All
strength comes from pain.
All strength comes from pain. That's right. And all wisdom comes from suffering. That reminds me of the poem or this passage. I don't know where I read it. In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. So
that's right.
Great.
And you can find this also in pagan traditions if you go back. So in the Bible, in I think it's 2 Thessalonians, there's a whole thing about be grateful for hard times. Basically, Paul says to the Christians, if you go to sort of, Aeschylus, plays like Prometheus Bound. So the ancient Greeks, he will say, thank God because God gives pain and from pain comes wisdom. So this is a very ancient thing that goes across cultures. And, it's just true to your own life. I mean, you will know if you sit down and reflect on your own wisdom and your own strength, how much of it comes from challenging times that at the time you did not like, but in retrospect, you were grateful for.
I was just talking with a friend, we were talking about how much we learn from success versus failure. Because it's more salient through failure. And we were also thinking that if all you ever had was success in your life, you probably wouldn't learn much. There's just not that much feedback to take from. So
that's exactly right.
Other than your luck is you and you're brilliant, keep going, right?
Right. Keep rolling those dice at the casino. Yeah.
This is great. So I don't want to, so the grateful thing. So I should just to put a stake in the ground here. To be grateful, I should think about the times I've had some challenges and I've come through them and I've learned something from them. I've grown. I've grown.
Growth is the purpose of life.
That
is the entire purpose of life. Everything in life grows. Plants, humans, children, they grow from struggle.
This is great. One real question. I don't want to deep dive in it, but just real question because I didn't understand it. You talked about grief. I didn't understand how to use grief. I didn't understand what you were saying.
Let me explain that real quick. And then just, unfortunately, I've got to go in like 5 minutes. Is that okay? Because that was the end of the podcast. Yeah. So I booked another meeting. I'm totally sorry for...
I wasn't keeping track. Yeah.
No. So what I talk about in the book is that everyone has their own life story. And everyone's life story, their own life narrative is unique. But people who possess what we call anti-fragility, which is the ultimate form of resilience, which is the ability to get wiser and stronger from pain and suffering, like we've been talking about, have a certain similarity in their life structures. And that similarity is that their past is integrated and their future is branching. So we've just talked about fear and anger coming about because you don't have a lot of plans. Well, if you've got a branching future, you've got a lot of plans. So you're not going to experience fear or anger. But what about your past? If your past has to be integrated, and the reason for that integration is that when you have an integrated past, just like the momentum of a river, that integrated past provides you with your life direction so that if you hit a challenge, even if you have to deflect momentarily to get around it, you get back on course immediately afterwards. So you never get lost if you have an integrated past that provides you with your forward momentum. How do you know if you have an integrated past? You know that when you look over your past, you don't feel strong shame or grief about anything. What are shame and grief telling you? Shame and grief are telling you that your past is divided in some way. Specifically, shame is telling you that you're living as two people because there are moments in your past when you acted in a way that's inconsistent with other ways that you acted. So that's the divide in your past, is that you're two people. Grief is telling you that you are living in two worlds because something happened to you that you cannot reconcile with the world that you want to be living in. So maybe if you've lost a child, for example, or something else has happened to you, you say that couldn't have happened. And you dissociate from that event, and that event goes on in a different world, whereas you keep living in your own world. And so that is split. And so what you have to do to have that integrated past is go back to those moments of grief and shame and integrate them, make peace with them, decide which person am I? Accept that you live in the world where the hard thing happened, but that's okay because also the good things happen in that world too. So starting to integrate that, and then the more you do that, the more you'll discover this kind of unified sense of life purpose, and the more that you won't have flashbacks to grief, because that's the real problem with grief, is that when it starts to interrupt you in the present, because you start to freak out because that submerged memory of that bad thing happens, and you get tentative. And we know that people who have split past lives, whose past is split, who feel strong shame and grief, are less likely to act confidently and with consistent purpose in the present because they don't have that full momentum.
Angus, this has been fascinating and very, very helpful to me and I'm sure to others. Thank you so much for sharing. Where can people find you? I'm going to list it in the show notes.
The book is Primal Intelligence. Just Google Primal Intelligence. As I said, it's become a national bestseller, so it's probably everywhere. You've maybe heard too much about it already. You don't want to hear any more, but Primal Intelligence. My name is Angus Fletcher. I think I'm the only Angus in Ohio. So if you Google Angus in Ohio, you will find me. You can also go to operationhuman.com. operationhuman.com. You can take a free diagnostic, a free primal diagnostic, which will kind of tell you what your emotion is and what your intuition is and all that kind of jazz.
Thank you again.
Yeah, no, this has been delightful. And thank you I didn't know it was going to go in this direction, so I appreciate it.
Okay, man.
And I had a lot of fun talking.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit larryweeks.com, and we will talk again soon.